Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today's call on coronavirus disasters, housing, and homelessness. As always, we'll have a large call, so I'm going to give it another minute or two to allow for more people to join before we get started. Thanks for joining. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today's call. I'm going to give it about one more minute to allow for some more people to join before we get started. Thanks for your patience. Okay, hi everybody, this is Diane Yantel. I'm President and CEO of the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Thanks for joining today's call on coronavirus disasters, housing, and homelessness. I appreciate everybody joining. We have a really full agenda with a lot of important updates and news. And just to share at the top of the call that the Department of Treasury has posted the new updated FAQ on its emergency rental assistance program. And they make clear that this new FAQ supersedes the previous FAQ. I'll talk about it a little bit more later in the agenda, but I just want to note for everybody that that FAQ has been posted. We've talked about it at length on previous calls about the need for it. And it's very good. It takes many of our collective recommendations and certainly improves the guidance, although there's still more to be done. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later in the call. But I wanted to start the call in recognizing the really terrible time that low-income people have had in Texas and in other states throughout the South over the last week with the winter storm and the loss of heat and electricity and water in many cases. So we have on the line Eric Samuels with the Texas Homeless Network, one of our state partners in Texas. And I'm really glad, Eric, to welcome you to the call so that you can give us an update on what's happening in Texas with people who are homeless and low-income renters and share with us anything we can do to help. So Eric, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Diane, and thank you for allowing us to report out on this. And then once I get done reporting, I have a link that I can send everyone with resources on how to help if you wish to help, or if you wish to share it with your friends who might be wanting to help with folks in Texas and what they're going through. All right, let me get into this. There's a lot to go over, but I'll just try to hit on the high points. So I think it's important to say, number one, as I've talked to advocates, as I've talked to coworkers, service providers, people who provide housing across the state, and really anyone who cares about the issue of homelessness or really cares about Texas, the overwhelming emotion I'm hearing is one of rage. Rage that this was allowed to happen when this state was given ample time and warning to do something about our power infrastructure. About 10 years ago, we had a similar storm, smaller, but after that, regulatory commissions, they suggested that we winterize our infrastructure, and as we saw, that did not happen, and it resulted in what we saw last week. So some of the things that we saw last week, obviously people have died, people lost their lives in the storm. So far, I know of about 33. That number is going to go up. In fact, it could be up already in the news, and I just haven't seen it. Of those, we have learned of 6 people who died on the street. In Houston, a man died trying to ride out the storm in his van. A woman passed away at the doorstep of a church in Houston. We had people die of exposure in Abilene and Austin trying to camp out. And I just learned of 2 other people who passed away this morning. I just learned this morning of 2 other people that passed away in Fort Worth. I'm assuming of exposure. I'm sure we'll hear of others. Galveston had a lot of deaths that they're still looking into. In addition to the loss of life, there was millions of dollars lost in damage to facilities and infrastructure across the state. And we're going to be paying for this for quite some time and repairing that for quite some time. I know of at least 3 shelters. I'm sure there were more. I know of 3 shelters where they had busted water pipes and suffered catastrophic damage. 2 were domestic violence shelters, one in Dallas and one in Waco, who had residents trying to escape the cold in those shelters at the time. Luckily, everyone was able to get to safety, and repairs are beginning to happen in those places. And then this morning I heard about at Haven for Hope in San Antonio. It's a large campus that provides shelter and services. They opened their doors, and they were willing to help additional people more than they normally do, about 150 more people than they normally do. And they had a large water main break that left them with only one faucet that was providing water. So the 100 staff that came in actually before the storm started and camped out so they could be there to help out, they basically filled up water buckets and made the trek from outside to inside to fill up the toilets constantly, so residents could use the bathrooms. All the while, we had people across the state really working hard to get people in shelter, and overall, they did a good job of keeping tens of thousands of people safe. We had people going out before the storm hit to warn people that the storm was coming and let people know where the warming centers would be. After the storm hit, we had advocates and service providers and continuum of care leads going out and locating people and bringing them in if at all possible. One of our contacts in Amarillo, her and her husband drove around all night looking for people, basically every night of the storm, got just a few hours of sleep every day, and they were able to help people get shelter. We had someone in San Antonio, the executive director of South Alamo Regional Alliance for the Homeless, Katie Vela, went out and got stuck in the snow, and luckily was able to get out, but she was looking for people to get them into shelter. We had communities that were not opening shelters or not opening enough shelter space. Advocates in these communities, they kept going to the media, going to local government until they got these shelters or these additional shelters to open so they could help people. We had people outside being turned away from shelter who had icicles hanging from their walkers, or at least in one case. And then throughout this storm, we did have people that just stay outside, stay in tents, but our outreach workers went out every day, oftentimes twice a day, for well checks and to bring resources to help them stay warm and safe. So we're in the recovery mode right now, and we will be for quite some time. There is a moratorium in power disconnects for non-payment, and we're distributing information on applying for FEMA. But as I said in the beginning, it shouldn't have come to this. We surely would have had some problems, but the damage would have been minimal compared to what we have now if we would have taken proactive approaches and winterized our grid. And surely not as many people would have died. It's something that we should correct and ensure that it doesn't happen again. These once in a 100-year storms are happening way too often. Hurricane Harvey wasn't that long ago. So I'm sure another hurricane or winter storm in the coming years will happen again. So we have to be ready. So our agency has been compiling ways to help. So I can send the site out for those resources for anyone who is interested. And that is the summary. There is a lot to talk about, and we'll learn a lot more as days progress, but that's what we know so far.
Thank you so much, Eric, for sharing that. It is just heartbreaking and enraging, as you say, just horrific outcome for so many people when, as you say, it didn't have to be this way. I really appreciate you sharing this update. And as you say, if you can follow up and share a link or any additional information for how people who are on the line who want to help can, that would be much appreciated too.
Thank you. And I have just provided that link.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Eric. Please take care.
Thank you all.
Oops. Okay, so I am going to, I'm going to turn now to the update on eviction moratoriums and emergency rental assistance. I'm going to move that up on the agenda a little bit. And I'm going to give that update so we can move the slide back. So as I mentioned earlier, as we've talked about at length on this call, we have been pushing for the Department of Treasury to rescind the really harmful FAQ on its emergency rental assistance program that the Department of Treasury put out on the Trump administration's last day in office. So on January 19th, there was an FAQ published, and it required really unnecessary and burdensome documentation from tenants in many cases. It went beyond the statute in some cases and counter to the statute in some cases. So as you all know, we quickly, before that FAQ had come out, we had sent a letter with our recommendations, our collective recommendations for what ought to be in guidance from Treasury on its ERA program. And then after that FAQ came out, we quickly sent a letter to Secretary Yellen, Secretary Designate Fudge, and President Biden, urging that they rescind that FAQ and issue new appropriate guidance for the program. So when we've been working back and forth at length with the Biden administration team, who have been working really hard to get this done as quickly as they can, having just come into office and into their new positions. They held a number of listening sessions, which we participated in, and some of you did as well. And I think we already shared updates on that. And there were many times where the Biden administration folks were asking us for evidence of how certain practices looked on the ground with emergency rental assistance programs that were already in effect. And we were able to, with the help of many of you, share with them evidence and best practices that helped inform their decision making. So the good news is that they did just revise an FAQ yesterday. I was on a call, Sarah Sadian from my team joined me. We were on a call yesterday with some folks from the White House and the Department of Treasury to kind of get a brief overview of what would be in the FAQ. And it was just published just as this call was starting. And it's very good. They take many of the recommendations that we made to them. When I should say too that the FAQ, you can find it, I see that the team has already posted the link. You can find it on the Department of Treasury's website in the same place where the previous link was. That previous FAQ is no longer there. And in an email that some of us received from the Department of Treasury with this link, they make clear that this current FAQ supersedes the previous FAQ. So the previous one is rescinded and no longer relevant. They also make clear that, and they made clear to us in the call yesterday too, that their intention with this FAQ was to quickly, where they needed to, reverse the harm that would have been done from the guidance in the previous FAQ and really get out the information that was most urgently needed for program administrators to run their programs. They do intend to provide more guidance in the near future and probably lengthier guidance, and they intend to fill in some of the remaining gray areas. And they'll continue to work with us and with others and to ask for input on that further guidance. Any additional areas that need clarity, they intend to provide clarity through longer and more formal guidance. They also note they intend to have a webinar sometime next week. The Department of Treasury and the Department of HUD together will co-host a webinar on the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. And I should say too that next week, on next week's national call, we'll have as a speaker Noel Pollo, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Office of Community and Economic Development at the Department of Treasury, and he and his team are leading the emergency rental assistance programs. So the just brief synopsis of the good news here, and I'll ask Sarah to fill in whatever I miss, is that overarching good news is that they allow for self-certification. They call it self-attestation in almost all cases where eligibility is required. And the only place where they don't allow only self-attestation is for to prove residency somewhere. And they do give a lot of flexibility in what kind of documentation can be utilized to prove residency. If it's not a lease, they certainly recognize that there may be many people who have informal leases, and they allow for other types of documentation. In all other cases, including income certification, including eligibility related to reduction in income, eligibility related to being at risk of experiencing homelessness or housing stability, they allow for self-attestation, which is really good news. And one of the things that there was pretty much unanimous agreement from tenants, tenant organizers, advocates, landlords, program administrators, this really simplifies things for everybody. So it's very good news. They also followed our recommendation and allow for internet costs to be covered, although it's not actually covered as a utility, which is what we suggested. It is an allowable expense under other expenses related to housing, needs incurred directly or indirectly from COVID. So not all internet services are covered, but any internet service that allows renters to engage in distance learning, telework, and telemedicine would be allowed. On the self-certification, I should say, I can see somebody has already asked the question. No, states are not required to allow self-certification, but they are permitted to allow it. So there will still need to be state and local advocacy to ensure that the program administrators do utilize self-certification, because the Department of Treasury says that they can. But that's a great question. They're not required to do that. There's also a very positive improvement that's much more aligned with the statute, in that tenants who are in any kind of federally subsidized properties can be eligible for emergency rental assistance, which certainly is clear in the law. It's now clear in the FAQ as well, that if an eligible household is in some kind of federally subsidized or mixed use property, they can get ERA assistance as long as the ERA funds are not being used to cover a cost that's covered elsewhere, of course. And they also make clear that you may remember that up to 10% of the funds received by grantees can be used for other purposes, including housing stability services. And they give examples of that to include legal aid, which is another thing that we and many others really urged that they do. So those services can include housing counseling, fair housing counseling, case management, housing related services for survivors of domestic abuse, which is something we called out in our recommendations, and legal aid, which they call attorney's fees related to eviction proceedings. So it's all really good news. And Sarah, is there anything I missed or anything else that you wanted to underscore in the new FAQ? Sarah, are you on?
Yes, sorry about that. I was just going to point out a couple of additional pieces to it. One, by clarifying that the statute says that up to 10% of funds can be used for supportive services, we think that clarifies the issue that we saw under the Trump era guidance about that said previously had said that supportive services and administrative costs would come from the same pot of money. They clarify that that is not the case under this provision. At least that's how I'm reading it right now. They also shortened the time frame for when programs can provide assistance directly to tenants when in cases where landlords refuse to participate in the program. Previously, it was at 21 days. That's been reduced to as little as 10 days in certain circumstances.
Great, thanks,
Diane.
Thanks. I'm just looking through some questions. There's a question asking about, will school internet be covered, especially for people who have children at home or college students? And the answer is yes. It says in the FAQ, well, we know from the law that emergency rental assistance funds can be used for, quote, other expenses related to housing needs incurred directly or indirectly due to COVID-19. And so they define other expenses and they give some examples. And an example of another expense that can be covered is internet services that are utilized for distance learning. So yes, for schooling, and also internet services that allow renters to telework or utilize telemedicine. So that is an allowable expense. Let's see, Sarah, this might be a question for you because I know you've read this a little bit closer than I've had a chance to yet, but there's a question about, is there anything in the FAQ that requires 2 additional months of income documentation? I'm
going to have to read over that more quickly or more thoroughly to see that. I can respond maybe later on in the call for that. I believe that, I think it's probably likely that they took that out because that was a provision in the Trump era guidance that was not backed by the statute. Right.
Yeah, I agree. I'm looking at it now. I think that they took that out. That's not there. Let's see if there's some other questions here. Lots of people really pleased with this new FAQ, as are we. Oh, right, really important point. Kristen, thank you for asking. I can't believe I didn't mention it because it's one of the more important ones around landlords who refuse to participate. So they did, in this FAQ, they shortened the period of time for when a program administrator can determine that a landlord is not participating, so that they can give the resources directly to the tenant. Let me see if I can just find that section. Okay, so previously in the previous FAQ, they had allowed for up to 21 days, which we had made the case is far too long. So they do shorten that period of time in this FAQ and say that outreach is considered complete if a request for participation is sent in writing, then it's considered complete within 14 calendar days after mailing. Or if the request is made by phone or text or email, there has to be 3 attempts over a 10-day calendar day, not business day, a 10 calendar day period. And at that point, it can be confirmed that the landlord is not willing to participate and they can work directly with the tenant. So it's a much shorter period than what was in the previous FAQ. Somebody's asking the question about, to clarify, the housing stability services, including legal aid, is not being considered in the same 10% pot as the administrative costs. So that's question number 23 in the FAQ. And 23, note that the Act allows for up to 10% of the funds to be used for housing stability services. And then they define housing stability services and they include attorney's fees related to eviction proceedings. Let's see, a few more questions we could hear. We also, NLIHC just sent out a broad e-blast to our full network with some of the top line takeaways and a link, so you can see that as well. Sarah Hasmer is asking about whether there is a requirement for any Social Security numbers, and there's not. And I will say that the previous FAQ did not actually ask for the Social Security number of the participants. It required the Social Security number or tax ID number of the landlords. And in this FAQ as well, I will say there continues to be nothing in the law or in the guidance that prohibits utilizing these funds for any immigrants, documented or undocumented. There's a question about income targeting thresholds and whether there are any changes or clarifications. There's really not. So we had asked, of course, that the law requires that eligible participants make 80% or below area median income, with a preference for people who apply who have incomes below 50% of area median income. We asked the Department of Treasury to further define that preference and require deeper income targeting. They have not. They did tell us in the conversation yesterday that that's an area that they will still consider for potential future guidance. But in today's FAQ, they simply note that grantees should establish a preference system to prioritize assistance to households with incomes less than 50% area median income, and that they should document that preference system and inform applicants about the preferences. I'm going to look through some more of these questions. Let's see. Sarah, do you see any other questions that you want to jump in and answer while I'm reading through some of them too? We have a ton.
Yeah, sure. I think you answered this question about how much funds can be used for stabilization services. I will say that this is confusing in the statute, so it's unsurprising that all of us are having trouble understanding it. But to our knowledge, the administrative fees would come off the top of the total amount of funding provided to each state and locality. And then of the remaining funds, 90% would be for financial assistance and 10% would be for stabilization services. This is something that is very confusing the way that the bill is written, but I believe from my reading of this FAQ that they resolve that issue, or at least attempt to resolve that issue there. I see a question about tenants who are federally subsidized. Diane hit on this before, but I'll just reiterate that the FAQ makes clear that households currently receiving federal housing assistance can receive emergency rental assistance, but that emergency rental assistance can't be duplicative of assistance that they are already receiving. So for example, the example that we've been using is that for tenants who might have received an income recertification, but for whom that wasn't retroactively done, and those households still have back rent that's owed, then emergency rental assistance can be used to help those tenants. Let's see if I see any other questions that folks are asking about. I see questions about whether or not whether or not program administrators can either prioritize certain landlords or require landlords to accept less than 100% of the arrearages that are owed to them. There's nothing in this FAQ that would prevent that. And in fact, that is something that we have seen at the state and local level. Many jurisdictions have been trying to maximize their resources by requiring, for example, landlords to accept 80% or 90% of the funds that would be made available to them. So that is something that's not prohibited under this Treasury guidance.
Great, thanks, Sarah. I think we actually covered many, maybe not all of the questions, but a lot of them. The one more, and much more to come, we sent out the e-blast with the link and with a high-level takeaways of especially all of the good news, the positive changes that we hoped to see that are reflected in the new FAQ. We'll do a deeper analysis and we'll update our own FAQs and send that around to everybody when it's available. And as mentioned earlier, HUD and the Department of Treasury intend to have a webinar on the Emergency Rental Assistance Program sometime, I believe, in the next week or two. And on next Monday's call, we will have from the Department of Treasury the lead on the emergency rental assistance to answer further questions. Also wanted to remind everybody that at NLIHC, we are tracking all of the emergency rental assistance programs that have been created or expanded during the pandemic. At last count, we're up to about 630 emergency rental assistance programs that we're tracking. Many of those, the vast majority of those, were created in the earlier months of the pandemic, but we are now starting to see a number of statewide programs and many city and counties begin to open their emergency rental assistance programs with their portion of the $25 billion in emergency rental assistance. We are updating the database 3 times a week, so check back often. I especially expect now that this FAQ is out, that we will see many programs opening in the coming days and weeks. There were quite a few that we knew of, and many more I'm sure that we didn't have direct knowledge of, but that were waiting for the new FAQ to come out with good reason before they opened their program. So I do think there will be dozens and dozens and eventually hundreds opening in the next few weeks. So check that database often. And we will continue to be analyzing and researching and sharing out best practices from what is working so that other communities can replicate. Okay, also just quickly to say on the eviction moratorium, the national eviction moratorium, I mentioned last week that the White House and Treasury and HUD and several other agencies, including the CDC and the CFPB and the DOJ, have had a number of listening sessions with stakeholders as they continue to consider both the need to further extend the moratorium and to strengthen and enforce it. And we participated in listening sessions, certainly, and made the case for why it's necessary that they do all 3 as soon as possible, and will continue to push. We have reopened our sign-on letter to President Biden and the CDC director, urging that they further extend, enforce, and strengthen the eviction moratorium. At last count, we had over 2,000 organizations signed on, and we are reopening it now and asking for still more organizations to join us in keeping the pressure on and urging that these changes be made as soon as possible. So if you haven't signed your organization on, please do so immediately. And also, I'd really appreciate if you could share it with your networks and circulate it as widely as you can so we can get a really strong showing. The closing date for that will be on March, I believe it's March 14th or 15th. Oh, thank you, Elena. It's March 15th is the deadline to sign. So thanks in advance for any help you can give us in circulating. Okay, now I'm going to move to our next speaker, who I believe has joined. Let me just do a quick check before I introduce him. Okay, great. I'm going to turn now to John Pollock with the National Coalition for a Civil Right to Counsel, who is going to speak to right to counsel efforts around the country. And he has joined our call several times before. John, thanks so much for joining us again, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here. There's really a lot to talk about going on right now, despite the problems that COVID has created across the country. The right to counsel movement really has been able to respond to the traumatic mess that COVID has created in the housing courts. Where we were before COVID-19 was the movement was really significantly on the rise. We had 7 cities or 5 cities that had passed a right to counsel prior to COVID. There was really a growing understanding of why right to counsel needed to be part of the housing court process. And then since COVID, what we've seen is that the movement really has responded both locally and at the state level, and some now at the federal level too, of understanding why a right to counsel is so important, especially given what's been talked about on this call, the limitations of the CDC moratorium, the issues with getting rental assistance. There's a lot of motivation to recognizing, in addition to everything else that was already true in housing court, as well as the incredible spike of illegal evictions by landlords who don't want to wait any longer for the moratoria to expire. So we really are seeing, this is becoming a movement that has really surged. And these are all articles, from during the pandemic. So where we are right now, basically, is we have 7 cities, including 2 that passed in the last year, Boulder and Baltimore, that have a right to counsel for tenants facing eviction. We have now these states, Connecticut, Indiana, Maryland, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Nebraska, South Carolina, and Washington State, that have all introduced statewide legislation this year to provide a right to counsel. The asterisk indicates states that have already had a hearing on their bill, which is pretty incredible given that it's only February and these many bills have already had a hearing. And in fact, some of those bills have already advanced out of their first committees, which is really incredible and showing how fast this is moving. We also have a few jurisdictions where we're expecting introductions where they haven't happened yet: Delaware, Denver, New York State, and Seattle. And then at the federal level, there were bills in 2020 that were filed by a number of federal legislators, some of who have already contacted us and said, what can we do this year, this time around? So this slide, which just is really not intended to be discussed at length right now, but just given for purposes of being part of the slide deck and the recording, just shows you the spread of what the ordinances that have passed so far look like, basically in terms of who they cover, how they got there, how long they're going to take to be put into place, and so on and so forth. So what you can see is that they have different eligibility requirements, they have different scopes, they're funded slightly differently, and they're taking different numbers of years to actually be implemented. What's also really exciting to us is if you look at this list of how many cities are looking at right to counsel right now, this is not even the entire list. These are just the ones where we've had some really serious conversations, where research projects have started, where conversations with city and state legislators have begun. And you can see it's you have the Midwest, you have the South, you have the West Coast. It's really, all over the country that places are getting very serious about these conversations, seeing right to counsel as something that's both viable and essential during the pandemic and beyond the pandemic. And one of the things that's fueled that is the incredible success statistics that have come out of the places that already have a right. New York City is seeing 86% of the tenants remaining in their homes. Eviction filings have dropped by almost 1/3, which goes to show when you have systemic representation across the board, it changes landlord behavior. It changes the number of evictions that get filed. Landlords are more likely to negotiate, less likely to file cases that have no merit, and so on and so forth. So that's really an incredible statistic. And then the New York judges also have testified that the right to counsel has been incredibly effective and efficient from their perspective, not just from the tenant perspective and the advocacy perspective, but the judges are finding it's improving their courts too. San Francisco has seen a 10% decrease in the filing rate in just 1 year, and 2/3 of the tenants are staying in their homes. Also interesting is that virtually everyone that's tapping into the right to counsel is very low income, despite the fact that there's no income limit on San Francisco's right to counsel. And in Cleveland, the most recent data that just came out, 93% of those who are represented are avoiding an eviction or an involuntary move, in addition to getting more time to move where necessary or mitigating their damages. I would be remiss in not just making a mention that we've talked a lot about race equity and the importance that it has for the right to counsel movement. The vast majority of people in housing court are people of color, and they're also the people who most often lack access to counsel for wealth equity reasons. There's incredible data that has come out from Matt Desmond that shows exactly how much more people of color are in housing court than anyone else. And this map, which was created by the ACLU, was actually based on the Eviction Labs data, which has now been released subsequent to that. And I have the pointer to that in the source information below. And this is just data from the census showing how much basically the racial disparity is in terms of who's been saying they are unable to pay rent. The red bars representing unable, basically almost no possibility of paying rent, which is in the top quadrant is the Black tenants, and then the bottom quadrant is white tenants. And you can see that the red bars for Black tenants and being almost completely unable to pay rent or twice as high. These numbers have gotten somewhat better as rental relief has become available and other forms of relief have become available, but there's still a pretty wide gap in most jurisdictions between Black and white tenants. If you want to see all this information, we track all of the legislation and right to counsel information on our website. This is our interactive map where you can see the latest activity. We also have bill details and links to the bills on a separate page where we track all right to counsel legislation, housing or otherwise. And if you want to know what states have a right to counsel already in housing court, which is none right now, but there's some at the city level, you can also see this on our interactive map as well. And if you're interested in knowing what's been written about the right to counsel by, as far as everything goes legislatively, pilots, studies, and so on, we keep track of that on our bibliography too. I just want to mention also is that we're having a webinar series now about the right to counsel in housing court. We're featuring specific jurisdictions that have passed a right to having people from those jurisdictions talk about how they did it, how organizing played a role in it, the whole process. These are the next 3 sessions that are coming up. And you can also find these links at our website at civilrighttocounsel.org. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great, thanks so much, John. As always, really helpful information and tremendous work. I don't see any questions just yet. I see a few comments. One person commenting that even though Washington State is pending, there are several counties that are doing right to counsel on a trial basis, and it's going very well. Mm-hmm. There's William Higgins is saying it would be great if Maine implemented this as well. Oh, here's a question for you. How can the effort get started to implement something like this? He says it may not be possible to submit a bill for this year's session, but maybe as an emergency measure. Any examples or guidance you can give, John?
Yeah, absolutely. Most jurisdictions don't start with the bill right away. When they're beginning this effort, the first things that usually happen are there's a convening of stakeholders, identifying, what organizing there is and what legal services presence there is that wants to work on it, figuring out what data already exists, what data is necessary, determining what lawmakers are looking for, what would convince them. There are a lot of steps to that. I would encourage anyone who's interested in starting down the road to contact me at the information that's currently on the screen. The one other thing I'll mention is that in terms of getting the right to counsel off the ground, what a lot of jurisdictions are doing right now is they're tapping into COVID money where they can't get general revenue. And previously, and just still to some extent, they're using money from the CARES Act. They're using CDBG, ESG, and CRF money that was available under the CARES Act, which can be used for tenant representation, and in fact has been by, I think now about 30 jurisdictions at least that we know of. And we have the list of those on our website, which jurisdictions have used that kind of money for tenant representation. And then in the next round, in this coming round, trying to tap into the 10% of the emergency rental assistance funds that can be used for housing stability, using that for legal representation. That's potentially a lot of money, especially where jurisdictions don't need that 10% for actual rent relief because they've gotten so much more rent relief than they actually currently are projected to use. So we have seen some right to counsel efforts get off the ground using that money, which again is temporary, but can be really helpful for getting representation expanded, getting the courts more comfortable with the idea of representation, and getting the legislature invested in the idea that right to counsel is really important.
Really helpful. Thanks, John. There's also a question from Nakia. Oops, wait, I just lost it. Oh, okay. Saying that she appreciates your work. How are the right to counsel advocacy efforts incorporating the voices and inclusion of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, law school students, and graduates?
Wow, that's a great question. We haven't specifically targeted law students we have law schools that reach out to us and ask to be involved, and we sort of strategize about ways to do that. As far as graduates are concerned, I will mention that race equity is such an important part of the movement that we ourselves are going to be bringing on this summer with if all goes well, a race equity partner to actually help us strategize on how to make race equity a major part of all of the campaigns that happen across the country, state, local, and federal. And I think part of that conversation will be how to tap into sources like law students, graduates, how to involve people who want to be involved, how to make right to counsel to make that message that it really is a major race equity issue, which is currently not. If you look at the way the media has presented right to counsel and the eviction problem, race has not been nearly a factor in the discussion of the issue as it should be, despite the efforts that we and other people have made to really highlight that aspect of it. And so we're hoping that bringing on some additional resources will help us bring the issue more to bear and bring in more interested stakeholders in getting involved in the issue.
Thanks, John. There's a comment from Eric Burmeister who says Polk County, Iowa combined Iowa Legal Aid Council with its rental assistance program, and between the two had an almost 100% success rate in getting evictions dismissed, which is amazing. Great work, Eric. Thank you. And Hilda Ortiz asks John, how are jurisdictions that have right to city getting funds to implement outside of COVID-related funding?
So that's a great question. I will say too about Polk County is that if you have not released a report on your incredible success, I would encourage you to do so and share it, because we are increasingly hearing about these incredible results that legal aid is getting, some of which are combining rental assistance with their efforts, but a lot of those success stories have not been published. The data has not been published. The more we can get of those, the more we can carry that story to other jurisdictions and show them how it can be done. So I'd really encourage you to write something up if you haven't done so already, and share it. We would love to see that. In terms of funding outside of COVID, most of the jurisdictions that have done a right to counsel have used general revenue. That is the approach that we encourage. We certainly don't want to see a right to counsel built on private funding. It's not supportable. That said, there are some examples that in Cleveland, the United Way has been providing funding for the right for the very beginning of the right, as a way of bridging to when the city and county are going to be ready to provide full funding. The city is providing funding, just not enough. So the United Way is involved there. And in some jurisdictions, the Boulder right that passed, for instance, created a new tax on that basically was a landlord licensing tax. They already have a landlord license requirement, but they added a new fee related to that licensing requirement. And the money from that is being used to pay for the right to counsel. So sometimes, a licensing fee or a filing fee might be looked at for revenue for right to counsel, but more often than not, it's been general revenue.
Another question, John, from Mary Elsner is asking if you have any statistics on the percentage of families with children who are in eviction court that could be very useful for advocacy purposes.
And that's a great question. The only thing that I've seen on that is that the census is actually asking, when it asks tenants about their ability to make rent right now, one of the characteristics they ask is whether the tenants have children. And in fact, we have, there's a really useful website, which I'm going to drop in the chat, that we helped develop, that breaks down all the census data by state. You can do it, but for all 50 states. I'm going to just drop that right in the chat right now. And one of the charts that you can look at in there actually looks at the effect of some of these issues for families with children versus other people. It doesn't give you the number of people in court, because this is talking to tenants before they've been served with an eviction, but at least it gets to some of that kind of data. We don't, to my knowledge, have data on children. We certainly don't have it on a national level. We have some jurisdiction-specific data on who's going to housing court, and we find in some of these jurisdictions that overwhelmingly the people in court are people with children.
Another related question from Sarah Hesmer is asking if there's gender data on people in housing court, or just race data, or even better, if there's gender plus race crosstab.
Yes, actually, Matt, the Eviction Lab's data actually found that Black women were twice as likely to be facing eviction as white tenants. And I think that actually, it was on one of my slides basically, but you'll see that in the source, that was actually what they found. Specifically, the intersection of being both Black and female was the key to how bad the situation was. There's
also many requests, many thanks in the chat and the Q&A box for your work and for all this information and requests for the slide deck. So just to say to everybody that we will share it back out with follow-up information from the call. But last question for you, John, for now is from Gina Wilton, Ohio, asking about who are the main state partners and stakeholders in these efforts? She says legal aid, who else? Is there anybody we wouldn't expect?
So legal aid is definitely a major player in right to counsel. Community organizers are a major player. In fact, it would not have happened in New York or San Francisco or Boulder without organizing. They were the primary drivers, in fact. And the organizing is not always tenant organizers. Sometimes it's labor. Sometimes it's community-based organizations in other fields. Health groups have gotten very involved because they understand the impact of homelessness on health. So they are very interested in seeing a right to counsel pass. We also see, and religious groups in general that do community-based advocacy are very involved in the right to counsel. We see sometimes there are access to justice commissions that get involved. Sometimes judges actually will be extremely helpful in getting something done in a specific jurisdiction. Housing court judges who don't like what they're seeing in housing court sometimes will be extremely important allies. The legislators sometimes will get the ball rolling, whether they're state or city will be extremely interested in this. And county, I should also emphasize, county commissioners are increasingly looking at this and saying, we're spending an incredible amount of money on homelessness prevention, and why not spend it on, one step up the chain on counsel to stop people from being homeless in the first place. They're starting to get the importance of that. I mentioned the United Way before. I actually recently heard that the Federal Reserve in 2 states is now involved in right to counsel, which was really a big surprise to me that was not a player that we were aware of. The Democratic Socialists, the DSAs in many states are now activating on right to counsel. The ACLU is extremely involved in right to counsel, both nationally with us, as well as the state chapters are now increasingly getting interested and involved in right to counsel. So there are really, and I should mention the Autonomous Tenants Union Network is also, we've been working with them. So there are a lot of players. The last one, the one that we're sort of striving more to get involved with this are a lot of the national policy groups like Make the Road, the Center for Popular Democracy, Data for Progress. And actually, I didn't mention this in my slides and I should have, but Data for Progress just released this incredible data showing that the overwhelming majority of Americans support a right to counsel for tenants facing eviction. I actually will drop that in the chat too, because the timing could not have been better on seeing that data, and it really shows exactly why what's happening now is happening so much, because there is so much public support for it.
Great. Well, thank you so much, John. Really, really helpful as usual. Really tremendous work. Thank you for it, and please keep it up. And I think I got to most of the questions in the chat and the Q&A box, but I might have missed some. If you have a chance to hang out for a bit and scroll through, please feel free to interact in the Q&A in the chat box with everybody who's on. Thanks so much for joining, John.
Sure, happy to.
Okay, I'm going to turn now to our next speaker, Marcie Roth with the World Institute on Disability. She's the Executive Director and CEO, and she's going to talk about, we have talked at length on this call and in many working group calls about how to use the FEMA Executive Order on non-congregate sheltering to move people experiencing homelessness to safety. She's going to talk about how urgent it is that we do the same to move people that are in long-term care facilities to safety. So Marcie, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks for joining.
Thank you very much for having me. This is Marcie speaking, and I always appreciate the opportunity to be with you all. As many of you know, people in nursing homes, long-term care facilities, and other institutions are not considered to be experiencing homelessness and are thus denied access to some of the vital resources that others are accessing. For the past year, this disparity has had a deadly impact for people who are seeking to leave congregate facilities for less deadly non-congregate settings. According to the American Community Survey, 96.3% of all nursing home residents have disabilities. Just as a sidebar, 25.2% of people in prisons and jails also have disabilities. According to the CDC and many other credible sources, 39% of all COVID deaths have been in nursing homes. Many of us have heard that. And what that means is that 188,000 people with disabilities, 188,000 people have died in nursing homes. And I'm sure you won't be surprised to hear that most were Black, Indigenous, other people of color, and many of whom experienced poverty before being sent to the nursing homes. The Supreme Court determined over 20 years ago that people with disabilities have a right to receive services in the most integrated setting appropriate to their needs. And this is almost never an institution. So the Biden administration executive order that eliminates the 75-25 cost share for states in utilizing FEMA public assistance category B emergency protective measures is a wonderful win. However, people in institutions remain excluded from the FEMA non-congregate sheltering, and this has been deadly. For example, in Philadelphia, there were 20 people on a waiting list for nursing home transition services who were determined not to be eligible for the Category B non-congregate sheltering because they were not considered to be experiencing homelessness. All 20 of those people died from COVID. We've been trying to meet with FEMA about this since last summer. And I was looking forward to telling you that 20 plus organizations, including the National Low Income Housing Coalition, would be meeting with Acting Administrator Bob Fenton tomorrow to discuss access to non-congregate emergency protective measures. But for the fourth time, FEMA has canceled our meeting. I also want to point out that despite the fact that according to the Department of Justice and the courts, there are no waivers to the civil rights protections of people with disabilities in disasters, HHS and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid keep issuing waivers allowing states to admit people to nursing homes in public health emergencies for the needs of hospitals, not the needs of those individuals. As you can imagine, nursing homes are hungry to fill those empty 188,000 beds, and hospitals are very myopic in using those waivers to empty their beds. As a result, people with COVID are being admitted to nursing homes and are not segregated, and people without COVID are not adequately protected from others who have COVID in those facilities. And given that only 39% of nursing home workers have agreed to be vaccinated, the danger remains very high. As we speak, in the states that have been impacted by the extreme weather over the last week, many people went to emergency rooms because they needed a plug. They needed some access to power. They needed to be in a warmer location. They needed access to potable water. Many of these folks have been transferred to long-term care facilities. These are not safe places for people to be, and we have absolutely no idea what sorts of protections are being offered. And again, those Category B non-protective measures, non-congregate sheltering options are being denied to people who are not meeting a specific definition of homelessness. So I would really welcome the opportunity for all of us to be working together to make sure that we're optimizing this executive order. The states can no longer say they can't afford that 25%, and yet the states are not seizing the opportunity to do something different than they've been doing. And again, we've been trying to work with FEMA to give the states the tools that they need in order to reconsider asking for Category B assistance. And so far we've been unsuccessful. So again, I wish I had more to tell you about how hopeful we were about the upcoming meeting with FEMA, but we are absolutely in as much limbo as we have been. And I just saw that actually 501,000 people have died. It's no longer just 500,000. We've even gone up by another 1,000 people. So.
It's just terrible, Marcie. Thank you for sharing the really heartbreaking news that requires urgent action from all of us. There's several people. Todd Holloway says, thank you for being the voice of over 500,000 Americans who can no longer speak for themselves. And Jerry is also saying thank you for your informed and tireless advocacy on behalf of so many. I'm so glad you mentioned the fact that the meeting that we were supposed to have together with many others with the FEMA acting director has been canceled for the 4th time. You know, it's unacceptable, and we will continue to work with you and others to keep pushing to make sure that we have an opportunity to talk with the FEMA acting director about the urgency of really utilizing this new executive order and continue to really push states and localities to take advantage of it and move people to safety to stop these completely unnecessary deaths. So Marcie, I don't see any, let me just double check again. I don't, oh wait, there's one question here, hang on. No, actually, I don't see any questions right now, Marcie. So thank you again for joining, and please do check the Q&A and chat box for other questions that may come up. And once we do get a meeting with the FEMA acting director or the eventual actual director, I look forward to having you back to give an update.
Thank you very much. And one last thing I'd like to just add, and that is that we've been spending the last several days with the leadership from the Partnership for Inclusive Disaster Strategies, trying to support the mayor's office for persons with disabilities in Houston, the folks in Austin, and the folks at the governor's office for basic access to bottled water. We have thousands of people, probably close to 20,000 people who are seeking bottled water in Texas, and we have been unsuccessful. They have been unsuccessful in getting FEMA to get bottled water to the city to distribute to people with disabilities. And yeah.
Unbelievable, again and again.
Yep.
Well, thank you, Marcie. Thank you. And I encourage anybody who's on the line and hearing this and as outraged as we are to continue to join the Working with FEMA working group calls that we hold every week to talk more in depth about the challenges and how to overcome them on all of these issues. So thanks again for joining, Marcie.
You bet.
I'm going to turn now to our field updates, the first of which comes from John Pouchot, who is the Chief of Staff for the Mayor's Office in the City of New Orleans. So John, thank you so much for joining. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to speak to everyone. I have to say, while being on the call, I've learned a lot, and certainly become even more concerned about some of the issues that I know that we're all facing throughout the country, specific to COVID and also specific to other issues like the very first presenter discussing what's happening in Texas right now. So again, just want to thank everybody for the chance to talk a bit about the rental assistance program that we established in the city of New Orleans. And just to mention, I say again, to mention briefly, it's really a pleasure to speak and present in front of all of you as a former intern for the National Low Income Housing Coalition when the work was still being done to even establish a housing trust fund. I'm just really excited and proud to be a part of the work that's been done even in a small role, and continue to be happy to see all the great work that the organization continues to do. So just a little bit of background. City of New Orleans has received a direct allocation of $11.6 million from the Treasury to provide our rental assistance program. That's on top of some other work that we were already doing using CDBG dollars and also some private donation funds to provide rental assistance previously. This program, though, is set up specifically within the city. It is not being done in partnership with an external agency. We are expecting to get another $14 million from the state. We are going through some of the certification and compliance issues that are a natural aspect of the relationship between state and local government, but we're hopeful that we'll be able to use that money effectively and quickly and get it out the door. I will say the city is a little bit further ahead in the establishment and running of its program, in part because of the work that we've been doing to establish it previously. And so just trying to make sure that we're all on the same page is really important. We went live on February 15th. We've already received, I believe, 4,700 applications. We are laser focused on trying to maintain stability for our residents. And so this program is really a vital part of that work. And as everybody on this call already knows, the prevention of eviction can also help other public health aspects of the crisis that we're all facing now with the coronavirus. So a couple of things about the features of our program that we're really proud of and excited about that I'd like to focus on. And one is our relationship with the courts. We have partnered with the courts to ensure that any household facing imminent eviction for non-payment of rent is immediately brought to the front of our rental assistance line. So understanding that we all have limited dollars, the focus really was always going to be on housing stability. And so we know that the folks who are most likely to be affected by that instability are people who would be dealing with the process of eviction. And so those are the first folks that get attention in our program. While we realize that the moratorium is a very powerful tool, it is not foolproof. And so we need to work on in both the short and long term about how our processes that we're putting in place and that we've continued to have in place will work when the moratorium is over. Hopefully that won't happen for some time, but still. And so just a little bit more about that process. The courts send over a weekly docket, and the judiciary, executive branches work together with legal aid and some of our housing advocates to address any evictions that may be pending for non-payment of rent. Before the pandemic, again, as everybody here knows, we were already facing significant concerns about eviction like many other cities. So it is only further exacerbated by the situation we're all facing. Another feature of our program that really was just intended for us to be able to leverage the dollars that we were going to have access to make sure that we were providing maximum benefit to our residents. For any landlords that accept the federal funds, they will not be able to evict tenants for any reason whatsoever except for criminal activity for 90 days. That includes non-renewals of month-to-month leases. So if that would have been the only reason why somebody would have been evicted, they can't be for 90 days should the landlord accept funds from our rental assistance program. Additionally, for another 90 days after that first 90 days, landlords cannot accept those funds. Landlords that accept those funds will not to be able to evict unless with cause. So good cause means something the tenant did or failed to do, including other lease violations, criminal activity, property damage, and activity that threatens the health, safety, or peaceful possession of others. That's our definition. So there needs to be a specific reason. And just as an example, owner wants possession is not good cause under the provision. Really the intention for this was to provide, again, as much stability as we possibly could. Just to add again that non-renewals of month-to-month leases is not good cause for either the initial 90 days or for the second. And so this provides hopefully some additional stability for our residents for another 6 months up to. So just a few other things to touch base on while I have all of you. I just wanted to follow up about for from the city's perspective, the importance of housing counseling, and thank all the advocates and the folks who are working day to day on making sure that housing counseling continues to be at the forefront of some of the requests that we're making to the federal government and to others. Again, I know I'm speaking to the choir, but we know the effectiveness of counseling, in particular HUD certified counselors who've been intervening on borrowers' behalfs on foreclosure-related pieces have been able to have an overwhelmingly high success rate in preventing or in working out forbearance programs and workout programs as well. And just hearing on the line, again, the importance of representation on things like eviction as well are really, really important issues. And so we would just echo the support of those and thank those who are working so much on those issues. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thanks, John. That's very helpful. I really appreciate the work that you're doing. I appreciate you sharing it. I especially appreciate just how thoughtful and deliberate you all are being about ensuring that the rental assistance funds go to really keep people from being evicted and keep people stably housed. Unfortunately, we've seen in other areas where there are requirements of landlords to receive the funds, requirements to ensure, longer housing stability for tenants, that we've seen landlords more willing to walk away from the program than being willing to sign on to those requirements. So what are you doing to engage with landlords or ensure that they do remain in the program? And if they don't, how are you thinking about ensuring that that tenant's back rent still gets paid?
So that's a great question. So I think a couple pieces with this. I think first off, I think we think about case management oftentimes as an assumption about the individual resident of whatever property is being discussed when thinking about rental assistance. But the case management and communication with landlords is also really, really an important part of the process, right? Our focus is certainly on our residents who are experiencing housing instability, but we try to talk to our landlords with respect and dignity, and understand that many of them are also financially hurting right now, and that some of the properties that have tenants within them are properties that they're afraid of losing, that are multi-generational properties. We've had a couple of other presenters talk about the importances of race and equity issues. The ability to have intergenerational wealth transfer to your kids is really important for everybody, but in particular in Black communities in New Orleans, and for a sizable segment of the small rental community, this is how they're able to both maintain what their parents provided to them and provide it to others. And so I think some of it is having conversations about mutual respect and the communication that we have with landlords. But also there are aspects of the design of the program so that if a landlord is refusing to use these dollars to or refusing to follow the rules, for lack of a better term, these dollars can follow the tenant, right? So if the tenant leaves, then the landlord wouldn't have access to the eviction funds that they had before. I will say that some of the specifics of the situations that we might get to in the future, where a landlord might argue to change their mind after they've received payments, is definitely something that we're on the watch for, and there's certainly some concern because we know that folks will likely test it. I will say that in many ways the same leverage about the strength of and legality of contracts that protect landlords from what I would personally call arguably questionable practices sometimes when it comes to evictions will also help the city as it creates its own individual contracts with these, well, I'm calling them contracts, but these individual agreements with these landlords who are accepting these dollars. And so I do think that we get into a situation where there's the potential for specific performance, if not other types of penalties. So I hope that answers that question.
It does. Yeah, great points. And yeah, much appreciated. The only other question we have, John, is somebody asking where they can find this New Orleans eviction policy online. So if you could post that in the chat or the chat box, and we can include it in follow-up materials that we'll send out to everybody, that would be
Yeah,
helpful.
let me follow up with you after the call, because I just want to make sure, just to make sure I'm understanding the question though. Our rental assistance policy piece, or the eviction requirements of the program itself?
I'd say both would be helpful.
Okay, I'll shoot you everything we got.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, John. I really appreciate you joining the call today and sharing your good work.
Definitely my pleasure, and thank you all.
All right, bye-bye. I'm going to turn now to our next fields update, which comes from Adrienne Bush with Homeless and Housing Coalition of Kentucky, where she's the executive director. And Adrienne, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks for joining.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Diane, and thank you to everyone on the call. I just want to provide a brief update from Kentucky. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, great. So in the last week or so, we've had some definite media attention that originated from the Louisville Urban League, stating that 950 evictions were filed in Jefferson County in 2021 so far. The Louisville Courier-Journal came out with a pretty in-depth piece today in print and online, showing that from the time that the CARES Act moratorium ended and the state weakened its protections around eviction moratoriums, there were 1,298 judgments from August to December. And then probably the most egregious thing that we have seen lately is highlighted in an article from the Kentucky Center for Investigative Reporting. Basically, the Louisville District Courts upgraded their Zoom account for remote appearances at the end of January. They didn't really bother to tell anybody about it. And so you had eviction court proceeding remotely over Zoom with renters unable to call in and be present. And while this was happening, the court officials were taking time to call the attorneys for the landlords to make sure that these judgments could go through. So we have been really blessed in Kentucky to have statewide Kentucky Equal Justice Center who found out about this, and then it actually filed a lawsuit in federal court. We know from this lawsuit, at least one plaintiff had invoked the CDC declaration, but it was ignored by the court because she was not present, because she didn't have the correct Zoom login info. Next slide. So our outreach continues. With the current moratorium in place, we know it's not perfect, but it has protected a large number of Kentuckians and a lot of people nationwide. And so again, we are really fortunate to have Kentucky Equal Justice Center, who developed an app that can be downloaded on someone's phone or visited online, homerenterdeclaration.org. It can be used anywhere, which is why I'm including it in this update. It's not Kentucky specific. And the good thing about it being used on an app is that you can go ahead and it will send the declaration to your landlord for you. Next slide. So in analyzing what has to change as we move forward through this pandemic, we ask ourselves, why are evictions continuing? And in Kentucky, similar to many other places, but these are the trends that we've observed in Kentucky. And it's not just an urban thing, it's not Louisville, Lexington, it seems to be a problem in all 120 counties. Basically, leases are expiring and not being renewed, and then renters become that holdover tenant. Filings and detainers for other lease violations, something that wasn't really a problem a year or two ago suddenly becomes an evictable offense. Then we also see judges issuing judgments for non-payment of rent if the renter isn't present, or as in the case of Jefferson County, Louisville, if they can't be. Or especially in rural Kentucky, we have folks who are on no lease at all. And that presents a problem also with emergency rental assistance. And then of course, we have had landlords who refuse rental assistance and then just turn to the courts for relief, such as it is. Next slide. So in Kentucky, we do have 3 jurisdictions that received emergency rental assistance through the Treasury Department. It is available in all 120 counties. Louisville received about 23 million, Lexington about 9.5, and then the rest of the state, the balance of state, received about 226 million. And all 3 portals were opened by February 15th. I think some of the jurisdictions wanted to open sooner, but the Treasury guidance that was issued on the last day of the prior administration really was very problematic, and so really delayed this money getting out the door. All 3 have been aligned and working together to try to make sure that the parameters are the same. In some changes from the Coronavirus Relief Fund that was available in the fall, where there were some landlord concessions, they have amended it to include 100% of past due rent as opposed to 90%. This goes back to April 1st, 2020, and it also includes up to 3 months future rent. Same deal with utilities. They do ask that that landlords forgive late fees, penalties, interest, and legal and court fees. If folks don't have a written lease, they actually have a sample lease where they can work together to get that. And then must not agree to evict for any past rent due prior to April 1st, and must give 30 days notice for any future eviction. And that is not to be initiated until at least 45 days after the assistance concludes. Next slide. The other interesting thing that has happened is with the CARES Act money, Kentucky finally has enough money, where we are a smaller state, to implement rapid rehousing assistance for people experiencing homelessness in all 120 counties. For people, regardless of how they present in a familial status, or, prior to this, we had veterans programs, we may have domestic violence programs. We have finally gotten enough money available to meet the needs of people, men, women, children experiencing homelessness. The second thing I just wanted to mention, that vaccine deployment it continues to be an issue. The state has prioritized staff in homeless shelters. At first, it seemed like they were going to be part of 1C, which is kind of in middle of the pack. We were able to do some advocacy, and they should be included in the 1A prioritization, but we really haven't had much luck around getting people experiencing homelessness moved up in the prioritization line. So if anyone has any questions, my contact information is on the slide. And with that, I'll turn it back to Diane.
Thanks so much, Adrian. There's really a lot of very helpful updates. I appreciate it. And we've had a couple of requests for your slide deck, so we'll be sure to include that in follow-up material. Thanks so much for joining. All right, I'm going to turn now to our last speaker, which is Sarah Sadian, to give an update on the new housing and homelessness resources that will be in the next COVID relief bill, and process and progress on that. So Sarah, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Diane. We've talked many times over the last couple of weeks about how Democrats in the House and Senate are moving quickly to pass their next COVID relief bill. That is still the case now. We expect the House to wrap up their process of voting on the relief bill by the end of this week. And just to know that they're now calling it the American Rescue Plan Act, and so we'll start calling it that going forward too. I will share, or I'll ask a colleague of mine to share our fact sheet on what's in the bill in the chat box for you all, but I'll just give you a sense of timing for how this is moving forward. All of the various bills from each committee have been put together in one single package. The Budget Committee has reviewed every line of it to make sure that it complies with the budget reconciliation instructions that were given to each committee. And we expect the House Budget Committee to vote today to prep the bill so that it can go to the floor as early as Thursday. We originally had heard that the vote wouldn't be until Friday, so this sounds like things are moving along quite well. Altogether, all of the different bills add up to $1.956 trillion, which means that it's about $67 billion or so above the $1.889 trillion that Democrats had planned for. And so we expect to see later this week some offsets that they need to provide in order to keep that bill under the dollar amount. In a budget reconciliation process, complying with those sort of budgetary numbers are incredibly important, and so we expect to see that move forward. We haven't heard anything about whether or not those cuts or offsets would come from housing and homelessness programs, but it's definitely something that we're paying really close attention to. When the bill goes to the House floor, Democrats can only lose a handful of votes on the bill from Democrats, which means that it's incredibly important for you to weigh in with your members of Congress to urge them to vote for the bill. It's also especially important for you to still reach out to Republican representatives, although we expect most, if not all, to vote against the bill. It's really important for them to hear about why these resources are so important. After the bill passes the House at the end of the week, we expect it to move quickly onto the Senate side. They are skipping the committee process and going straight to the Senate floor. Once it is received on the Senate side, there will be several hours set aside for debate. We've heard 20 hours for debate, during which Republicans will likely offer amendments on the bill. We don't have a lot of heads up about what amendments will be filed. It's a very quick turnaround process, but we do expect several amendments to be offered that would either cut funding for programs, restrict access for undocumented people, shorten timeframes for being able to spend down funds, or increase penalties for fraud and abuse. And so when you reach out to your senators, I want to encourage you to encourage them to not only vote for the bill, but to vote against any amendments that would make it more difficult to serve households in need. Altogether, we expect the process to be finalized hopefully by mid-March, which is when unemployment benefits expire and other protections start to expire. Because we do expect some changes will be made on the Senate side, the final bill will either have to go back to the House for a second vote, or they will go to committee to hash out the conference committee to hash out the differences. And we'll know more about that as we move along. Thanks, Diane.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So lots coming up that will require all of our action. Please take Sarah's advice and urging, and do call your member of Congress. Call today. Make the case for why these resources are so essential. Urge them to support this legislation in the House and the Senate. We'll send a call to action out soon to help you connect with your members of Congress. So keep an eye out for that. Also, throughout the week, as always, please feel free to join any of our working group meetings. We'll have tomorrow will be our policy working group meeting. I believe it's at noon or 12:30. We'll put the link for that in the chat box. Also on Tuesdays at 3 is our working with FEMA working group calls. And this week we're going to have some folks from Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid and Disability Rights Texas to talk more about the winter storm and impacts on people experiencing homelessness in Texas. So please join to find out more about that. On Wednesday, we have our regular state and local implementation working group talk more about emergency rental assistance. We'll talk more about the new FAQ and its implications. And then again, join us next week where we'll hear from folks from the Department of Treasury about that ERA FAQ. So much more to come. Thank you all, as always, for all of your great work, for your advocacy, and for joining today. We'll talk again soon. Take care. Bye.